Okay, today we are going to jump right into past President Ted Kleisner's presentation with his in-depth talk about the Greenbrier Bunker, Part 2. The epilogue, debriefing, disclosing, declassification, and decommissioning. Not only was Ted the CEO of the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, he also had the responsibility of overseeing this top secret project with the federal government with this bunker, which was 720 feet below the Greenbrier. And that could house all 535 members of Congress in the event of a nuclear attack. Ted, by the way, was only 36 years old when he got hired for this job. Even though hundreds of media outlets have covered this story, today we are going to have a behind the scenes look about this historic project. Ted's hospitality career started right here in this very hotel in 1973. Matter of fact, 40 years ago, Ted was giving his first ever Rotary speech on the topic of the police merger. So here are some fun things that I learned from Ted's bio. His career took him 4 decades journey throughout the US, Bermuda, Great Britain, and Japan. Ted is an honorary member of the famous Gridiron Club of Washington, D.C., the oldest, most prestigious journalistic organization. Ted was elected in 1998 to membership in the Royal and Ancient Golf Club of St. Andrews in Scotland. And Ted spent 5 years in a Franciscan monastery studying theology. He and his wife, Karen, have been married 50 years. They have 2 children, Carrie and Teddy, and they have 7 grandchildren. So please welcome to the podium past Rotary Club of Savannah President, Ted Kleisner.
Thank you, President Marjorie, particularly for reminding me of my 5 years of monastic life. You get to a point in that life when you have to take what is known as final vows. They're poverty, chastity, and obedience. I looked the abbot right in the eye and said, would 2 out of 3 work? And poverty, I mean, who wants that? Good afternoon, Rotarians and guests. Last year, I shared with you a remarkable story. It began in 1956 with the beginning of the rolling cauldron that would become known as the Cold War. My focus at that time was on President Eisenhower's planning for the continuity of government program intended to preserve our tripartite system of government and the world's oldest continuing democracy if the Cold War went hot. While the executive and judicial branches had provided for their survival through relocation shelters completed in the mid-50s, Ike had run out of patience with the legislative branch for their failure to ensure Congress's ability to reconstitute in the event of global thermonuclear war. So the president called the bipartisan leaders in the Senate and House into the Oval Office and convinced them that they would covertly and unilaterally begin the site selection for Congress's bunker with him. As a result, the relocation site for the legislative branch, codenamed Project Greek Island, was completed in 1961. What was it? It was 112,000 square feet, encapsulated in 10 feet of reinforced concrete and steel. It was located beneath a wing that was built by the government as a cover facility, actually 1 story below that wing and into the hill, Copeland Hill, in the Greenbrier in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. Now, to clarify this, beyond my responsibilities as CEO of CSX Hotels and the Greenbrier. My other job I unwittingly found myself involved in was to maintain, in coordination with 14 federal workers, Project Greek Island. It was maintained at a high state of readiness, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and 365 days a year. The federal workers, cryptographers, and communications specialists were ostensibly the audiovisual specialists that provided services to the Greenbrier guest. For 40 years, this public-private partnership remained a top secret project hidden in plain sight right there in front of Greenbrier guests, essentially. Not even the members of Congress, beyond the four bipartisan leaders, were ever briefed on in the top secret compartment of this project. Secrecy was of paramount importance. On May 31st, 1992, that all changed when the Washington Post published an 11-page article in their Sunday edition, written by investigative reporter Ted Gupp. The article disclosed the location of the doomsday bunker for Congress. And because it depended on secrecy for its only absolute protection, it was then rendered useless. Its declassification and decommissioning would span the next 3+ years. As I finished my remarks last year, I asked somewhat rhetorically, why, may you ask, did that process take over 3 years? And I answered somewhat cryptically, that's a story for another day, but a very interesting one also. So here we are today, a little over a year later, and today is my day to tell that story, actually for the first time. We'll also give you some insights into the politics and the cloakroom maneuvering, if you will, that is involved in our government's covert side. Now, little did I know that the term Cold War would take on a new reality in just 1 year as Mr. Putin placed his 6,500 nuclear warheads at a high state of readiness following his invasion of the Ukraine. Mr. Gupp, this man, the infamous reporter, spent 3 days at the Greenbrier investigating the existence of a congressional bunker. This was following an anonymous tip, as he put it. Before leaving the Greenbrier, he insisted on one last meeting with me, and he insisted that it be at my home. He was fairly straightforward. Mr. Kleisner, he said, I've already selected the title for my article. It's going to be The Last Resort. I can make you look like a hero, or I can make you look like a fool duped by the covert operators in Washington. It's your choice. On the other hand, if you can explain to me how this facility would work to protect the legislative branch, given the innovations in delivery systems for nuclear warheads over the last 30+ years, while you and some of your friends were going through what is commonly known as the continuity of government program, I will spike the story myself in the interest of national security. Now, I carefully filed that challenge in the back of my mind, and I didn't respond. I continued the denials required by the oath to which I was sworn to in 1980, and nervously bid Mr. Gupp farewell. But deep down in my heart, I knew the genie was out of the bottle. The next 3 years would start with a debriefing. And as luck would have it, as they say in Murphy's Law, when things, if anything can go wrong, it absolutely will go wrong. Unfortunately, January 27th, 1992 was going to be one of those days. After dealing with Mr. Gupp's persistency, I tried to reach Fritz Bugas, the federal project director of Greek Island. He had been on holiday in Florida and had been off the grid. I finally contacted him only to find out that he had been in an auto accident on I-95 while trying to hurriedly return to White Sulphur Springs. He gave me instructions on reporting the breach in project security and said he would be back as soon as he could. I called our contact, if you will, in Washington and reported some of the details of my visit with Mr. Gupp. And I was told to keep the lid on the details until a Department of Defense debriefer could interview me in person. Now, thankfully, Fritz would return to White Sulphur Springs in time for us to sit down and go over the various details, or every detail of my 3 days with the reporter. After going over all the details, we both came to the same conclusion. We had simply been lucky. Gupp was not an inexperienced reporter who just stumbled onto a national headline. His background told a different story. He was a lawyer by profession, a locum tenens professor of journalism, and he had written recently a Newsweek article exposing Mount Weather, a somewhat overt relocation site for the executive branch. Now, through Fritz's interesting resources in Washington, we discovered that what Mr. Gupp had told me in his last statement was absolutely correct. Gupp had actually spiked several of his own stories when confronted with implications of national security. Our humorless Department of Defense debriefer arrived, and his body language alone told me this was going to be a long day. We met in the bunker's skiff, a secure compartmented information facility. And he began with a reminder of the oath that we both took and signed during our first briefing on the project, and the penalties for disclosing top secret and classified information. We were reminded that disclosing top secret information in federal law is considered prima facie evidence of treason and damage to national security. After endless mind-numbing questions and sharing every detail of my 3 days with Mr. Gupp, I was asked to place in writing all my recollections. Yes, they had less than subtle ways of reminding you better get it right when you write it all down. We then shared with the debriefer our solution for the immediate problem. Based on Fritz's investigation of the reporter and recalling his last request to me, all we needed to do was to bring Gupp into the club, as we referred to it. Give him a full top secret briefing, explain the details, logistics, and most importantly, the operating plan for Greek Island. We were certain that Gupp would then be convinced of Greek Island's necessity, and like a few skeptics in government who were similarly briefed, he would also understand how Greek Island would allow the US Congress to convene and our constitutional republic to survive a catastrophic event of unimaginable proportions. While the solution seemed logical and straightforward to me, that's just not how government works in DC. Instead, we were thanked for our time, and we were told that others in Washington had a better idea. And what was their better idea? Brent Scowcroft was the man to kill the Post story. Scowcroft, this gentleman to Bush 41's left, was the former national security advisor to President Ford And at the time, he was the National Security Advisor to the sitting president, George H.W. Bush. It was explained to us that Scowcroft had a personal relationship with Katharine Graham, the publisher and the chair of the editorial board of the Washington Post. Here she is with a few of her other more notorious investigative reporters. That's Carol Bernstein on the left and Bob Woodward, a little younger than they are today. 1973, as the Watergate was breaking, also in the Post. Their agreed upon solution, government's agreed upon solution, was to have Scowcroft meet with Mrs. Graham and her board and explain that the story must be pulled because it will compromise national security. He would share the special relationship government had with the Greenbrier and CSX. But he could not share the national security implications. I thought to myself, this is crazy. It's going to go from 3 columns on page 3 to a front page headline. Little did I know it'd be worse than that. The editorial board must have been drooling as Mr. Scowcroft made his presentation. We were also reminded that the project was not just top secret. It was top secret with access based on a need to know only. The ruling was that neither Katharine Graham nor the reporter were considered as qualifying for a top secret briefing based on their need to know. My head was spinning at this point. I didn't know quite what to say or do. The only thing I knew for sure was that we needed to prepare for disclosure and the fallout that would follow this Washington Post article. Next, it was time for me to move on to one of my priorities. One item had the potential for even more significant consequences for me personally if it was not handled correctly. The Greenbrier, I'll remind you if you don't know, was part of CSX Hotels, Inc., company that I was CEO for. A wholly owned subsidiary of CSX Corporation, a Fortune 100 publicly held company. Every year I was required to sign as CEO a 10K, certifying to the Securities and Exchange Commission that all the financials reported within CSX Corp's financials, CSX Hotels financials were true and correctly stated according to generally accepted accounting principles. They, of course, were never true nor correct. Financial details of our relationship with the government were never included in any 10K. Those numbers were hidden in invented balancing entries in our statements. A separate set of substructure books marked top secret was kept in a container, a combination safe installed by the Department of Defense in my office. It was right next to my Stu 3 encryption government installed telephone. The bottom line I explained to our Department of Defense friends was that the 13 independent directors of CSX Corporation needed to hear from our partners in government before they read about our covert relationship in the paper. Only one director was allowed to be cleared on the project, and that was only at the secret level. I insisted, while I was told, don't worry about this, we can handle anything with the SEC, I was unconvinced and insisted that we develop an immediate solution. And to my surprise, they actually did. A senior member of the government team suggested that we record a video in the TV studio of the bunker itself. See it here, looking into the studio, and you'll see that same representation of the Capitol. What's even more interesting, and these were scattered throughout the bunker, the poster on the wall that says, "On vacation, remember security." The loose lips sink ships was another one that stuck with me, and they always seemed a little bit silly. So the video would then be developed. We wrote the script for it, and we staged it that night in the TV studio. So it could be hand delivered to each director 3 days before disclosure. A brilliant idea, I thought, and I breathed a welcome sigh of relief. Now, after the copies of the video were played for each director, they were immediately destroyed. Kind of like that scene out of Get Smart, they self-destruct or something. But all but one copy remains. And it is the copy that you're about to see. This has not been shown anywhere. And time doesn't allow to show the entire video, but this cut, it's about 2.5 minutes, will give you an absolute idea as to the message that was being imparted to each director. The person on camera is still operating within the darker side of the US government, so his identity has been obscured.
Welcome. Since the early 1950s, the CSX Corporation and its predecessor organizations have been engaged in an extraordinary partnership with the federal government to assist in the preservation of our constitutional framework. This association has been one of this nation's most closely guarded secrets. Your possession of this videotape means that an event has occurred which has resulted in the public disclosure of this confidential relationship. You and fellow board members were not privy to the existence or the nature of this partnership. I believe the necessity for this secrecy will soon become clear to you. However, it is recognized that by virtue of your position, stockholders and the media may now be looking to you for comment or explanation. The purpose of this briefing is to inform you of CSX's unique contributions to the national security and to provide guidance regarding inquiries from the media. This story begins in the early 1950s. At that time, there existed an emerging threat of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. The president and his advisors feared that an attack upon Washington, D.C. could severely hinder the nation's capacity to defend itself. The ravages of a nuclear war could also cripple the ability of the three branches of the federal government to reconstitute themselves and to continue with essential obligations and services to the states and to the American people. What was needed was some assurance that a residual capacity to govern could survive a nuclear attack. The future of the Greenbrier facility will be decided by the joint congressional leadership. In the meantime, the exposure of the project is likely to prompt additional questions from the press. Because this project is a federal responsibility, it has been deemed appropriate that the government act as the primary focal point for press inquiries. An initial press release has been prepared for issuance by CSX headquarters, which offers some of the foregoing information and which provides an appropriate government point of contact. Additional statements, as necessary, will be developed by the joint congressional leadership. In closing, I wish to thank you for your personal cooperation in this difficult situation and again extend the government's appreciation for the contributions of CSX to national security. Good day.
So you'll note that one thing at the very end there, the government representatives wanted to make sure that everyone understood that they were in control, in particular as it relates to the press, which I argued against because predictably, they would find it difficult, as you'll soon find out, in how to deal with a press situation like this. I also, this was done in one take because that's all they would do. And I kept trying to tell the speaker that he was mispronouncing the word nuclear. nuclear. Anyhow, it went out. The directors were satisfied. We had a meeting, and I felt beyond relieved relative to what everyone thought I was supposed to be doing 100% of my time. Weeks went by without any reports from DC. Then I was summoned to a special meeting in the office of the architect of the Capitol, Mr. George M. White. This gentleman metaphorically embracing the entire Capitol. His was a palatial office comparable to the House Speakers or the Majority Leader in the Senate, even though it was about 3 stories subterranean. And it was windowless. Now, Paul Hansen and Sam McCatchern might be totally familiar with the position architect of the Capitol, but some of you may not be. Mr. White was the 9th architect of the Capitol in our country's history, and he was preceded by the first architect of the Capitol, William Thornton, in 1793, appointed by our first president. And 7 others, including this gentleman, J. George Stewart. J. George Stewart was the presenter on his stationery of this letter that is the actual genesis of Greek Island. This is the letter from the bipartisan leaders. The 2 signatures at the top, Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson, are unmistakable. But even more interesting, that the 2 below, William Nolan and Joseph Martin, they had just, the 2 of them had been Speaker of the House and Majority Leader of the Senate. 1955, there was a change due to a change in the majority. So the Democrats had taken over, and Johnson and Rayburn were in the position of calling the shots. But in fact, all the project's details have been developed by the other 2. The architect of the Capitol, just to quickly explain, is responsible to the United States Congress for the maintenance, operation, development, and preservation of 16.5 million square feet of buildings and more than 450 acres throughout Capitol Hill. He was also responsible for Project Greek Island. Until 1995, all the architects of the Capitol, like the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, of which there have been fewer at that point than architects of the Capitol, served for life, and that was changed to a 10-year term in '97. Our meeting that day included my boss, the chairman of CSX Corporation, and soon to be Secretary of the Treasury in Bush 43's administration, John W. Snow, the Chief of Staff to Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, Mike O'Neill from House Speaker Foley's office, the Chief of Capitol Police, the architect of the Capitol Staff and Security, and of course, the project director, Fritz Bugis, and the team to whom he reported to in Washington in special ops. The architect asked Mike O'Neill from the Speaker's office to update us on where we stood with the post. He informed us that Mr. Scowcroft's request, not surprising to me, was rejected out of hand by the Post. And the article would be published in the Post Sunday magazine, May 31st, 1992. It would be the cover of the magazine and 10 pages inside. It was way beyond my worst nightmare. He explained that CSX and the Greenbrier would have 3 days before the publication to share details with associates as we saw fit. And he proudly announced that they had successfully negotiated with the Post an embargo of the magazine until its publication. Now, everyone in the room seemed to think that this was a brilliant negotiation and that that embargo would make sure that there would be no leaks of any kind. I'm thinking to myself, in a city that is a literal sieve of secret information, I set the chances of the embargo failing at Oh, about 100%. Realizing that disclosure was imminent, I suggested that we develop a joint statement to respond to press inquiries. I was metaphorically patted on the head like a lapdog by Foley's staffer O'Neill, who said, "Ted, this will no doubt be a story in Greenbrier County, in White Sulphur Springs, and possibly even the state newspaper in West Virginia. But it probably would not survive a 24-hour news cycle." So we all departed. My head was spinning again. Cordial handshakes and tepid thanks for our support. CSX's PR and legal departments wordsmithed some brilliant responses to the press, and I awaited Congress's press release. None ever arrived. On Friday, May 29th, 1992, the Washington Times was delivered to my office early that morning. I opened the paper, and there in 72-point type, it's the Washington Times, not the Post, was the headline, "Bunker Under Hotel, Congress's Last Resort." The article included most of Gupp's reporting. However, that article was not going to appear until the embargoed article ran in the Post 2 days later. The Times had scooped the Post. The irony of the moment, very frankly, added some needed mirth to my morning. I immediately called Mike O'Neill in the Speaker's office and asked if he had read the Washington Times. He had not. I read him the headline. Dead silence on the phone. I then asked if he had the government's press release ready. He said it had not been approved by the legislative leadership. And I explained to him that while I was talking to him on the phone, there were 3 networks plus a cable network and a camera pool waiting for comments. And I could read their comment as well as I was going to read mine. Just get it to me. And he said, "Can you hold them off till 1 p.m.? I said I'd do the best I could. And till noon. I told him I would do the best I could. And then at 1 p.m., I hadn't heard anything. So I called Mike O'Neill again. And he said that there would not be any press release from the legislature other than to say no comment. Yeah, that just was unbelievable to me. I was stunned, and I asked why. And I just couldn't believe what I was listening to. Sheepishly, O'Neill said that they had a problem in House leadership. And specifically, when pressed a little bit further, I was told that House Majority Leader Gebhardt refused to sign off on any comments because he was never briefed on the existence of a legislative relocation facility. He had just been to the Greenbrier, attending a House leadership conference, and he insisted that he should have been briefed right then while he was there. Well, there's no fury like the fury of a politician ignored. The New York Times said it all. It was their headline on May 31st. Congress awaits fallout on bunker at a resort hotel. They quoted me well from our prepared release. The Greenbrier was proud to have been part of the nation's effort to preserve constitutional government in times of great danger to our nation. The Times article went on to say, Speaker Foley's office was spastic in their response to requests for comment. Boy, they didn't know the half of it. And the circus was not going to leave town anytime soon. On June 1st, 1992, the day after the article appeared, this letter from Speaker Foley's office to the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, arrived. An interesting bipartisan approach. Now, mind you, this is 1992. Following year is a midterm, and the Democrats would lose, I think, 53 seats. And including Mr. Foley's seat itself. He didn't win. He wasn't going to be speaker anymore, but he wouldn't be a member of Congress anymore either. So all of a sudden he's dumped with, or he has on his hands a 5-star fallout shelter for him to survive while everyone else is dealing with the catastrophe of unimaginable proportions on one of the slides there. So obviously he decided, well, what's the best thing I can do? I just shift it to the executive branch. Cheney will go for this. No, Cheney's response here, he was not biting on that hook. He was not going to accept the speaker's problem du jour. And he's just going to turn it over to his assistant secretary for command and communication and take a look at other uses for the facility, which was Foley's suggestion. Now, when you read these now unclassified notes by Cheney's staffers on June 3rd, you'll get an idea of the inside the beltway mentality that dominates DC. The handwritten notes start with delivered by hand only. They're written by Cheney's chief of staff. It's signed David, but through the Freedom of Information Act, you can get all kinds of documents, and comparing the signature of his chief of staff, David Addington, proves who that was. Bob Taylor, to whom the note is directed, is actually Colonel Bob Taylor. He's Undersecretary for Public Affairs at the Pentagon. Petty Howe is the Cheney's aide. And just follow these. It's just amazing to me. Did Speaker Foley ask the Secretary of Defense to look into alternative uses for the secret facility in White Sulphur Springs? Answer: yes, the Speaker has asked Secretary Cheney to look into alternative uses for the emergency relocation facility. And he has commented that an assistant secretary will conduct the review. Question, this is where it gets interesting. Does this mean that that you are confirming, you the secretary, the existence of the facility? This is where we get into the double talk that occurs so often. This means that the department is complying with the request of the Speaker to review for the federal government the use of the emergency relocation facility in White Sulphur Springs. As we've stated on numerous occasions in the past, the United States government for decades has engaged in a continuity of government program in the event of disasters ranging from natural to nuclear war. And however, beyond acknowledging that we do engage in continuity of government efforts, we do not discuss the details for security reasons. Therefore, and this is where you get to the real doublespeak, we do not confirm the accuracy or inaccuracy of the news agency articles dealing with this issue, nor will we discuss this matter any further. My friends, you just can't make this stuff up. It's right there in writing. They must have known it would come out eventually. It's called Washington Speak. And Washington Speak, in a combination of partisan politics and bureaucratic turf protecting, would dominate my next 3 years. And this is SecDef. It's going to be VP Cheney the summer before disclosure at the Greenbrier. And I just declined his invitation to go quail hunting. Following the government's acknowledgement, the title to the facility actually had been given to CSX Hotels when Greek Island was completed in 1961. The former audio-visual employees from Forsyth Associates began dismantling all the classified material, equipment, and removing all the weapons. I also watched them cut up hard drives from computers using a chainsaw. Greek Island was officially declassified and decommissioned on November 3rd, 1995. And this is from our press conference on that date. With me in the center is Fritz Bugus, the federal project director. And the smart gentleman, always seen in a bow tie, is George White, the architect of the Capitol, who served from 1971 until 1995. Fortunately, we were able to convince the powers in DC of the benefit of a curated historical representation of the bunker, which could be presented in a 10,000 square foot museum exhibit. And today, thousands tour the exhibit each month in what is actually part of Project Greek Island, the Doomsday Bunker for Congress. That's the open entrance and closed entrance, better known as the West Vehicular entrance to the bomb shelter itself. There were also hundreds of magazine articles. Next slide, please.
Good evening. It was one of the biggest mysteries of the Cold War. What would happen to the leaders of our government if the Soviets launched a nuclear attack on Washington, D.C.? Tonight, the incredible answer. Stone?
Maria, it's widely believed that the president has several strongholds where he'd be safe in the event of a nuclear war. But what about Congress? Until recently, only a handful of this nation's highest leaders knew the answer to that question. But very few of them had ever seen what we're about to show you tonight in this Dateline exclusive. It was among the country's most closely guarded secrets until now.
So we negotiated with Dateline NBC, our selected network, and the presenter, Maria Shriver and Stone Phillips, to give them an exclusive to go through the bunker the day it was declassified and decommissioned. It was a report that went so far. Karen and I were flying back from London the next week, and it was on the newsreel on the plane. I got up and said, I'm going to walk around and see if anyone recognizes me. Came back, sat down my seat. Karen said, so? I said, nope, not a one. But literally hundreds of magazines and articles have been published on this, and so much for the localized story that Foley's staffer had predicted. None of them were right about the press coverage. They were only right about one thing, and that is that Ted did not understand Washington, D.C., and I swear I still do not. This is the final clip from Stone Phillips on the way he ended the 30-minute exclusive.
It would seem the book on Greek Island has now closed. Another chapter in the Cold War ended. The government has stripped its classified equipment, moving it to an undisclosed location. And we couldn't help wondering if Greek Island's replacement hasn't already been built. Knowing what you know, isn't it inconceivable that other arrangements haven't already been made?
I'd like to believe that. I really do. It's that important.
If you knew about them, you wouldn't tell me though, would you?
It is that important.
So a little humor there at the end, don't you think? And now, please don't take my critique of the inside the Beltway politicians, bureaucrats, as criticism of our country, even with our failings, sometimes biased press, and bickering. The United States is still the best place to live and enjoy all the freedoms that are guaranteed by our American Bill of Rights. Now, as a postscript, allow me to share with you one meeting I only dreamed could happen. In 1996, Mikhail Gorbachev visited the Greenbrier. And through our director of security, he arranged a meeting. And he spoke to me, and I to him through an interpreter. After the usual exchange of social amenities, I asked the one question that had been on my mind for years of sitting through what were called vulnerability assessments for the project in Washington, D.C. Essentially, every time it was determined that we were never a target. I said, did you, President Gorbachev, know about the bunker at the Greenbrier? He turned and looked out the window of his suite. He spent a few moments just surveying the emerald hills around the Greenbrier and said, this area reminds me of the place where I grew up as the son of peasants with Russian and Ukrainian heritage. I operated a combine harvester on a collective farm. Like this area, my farm was so green and lush and rural. Why would anyone want to damage such natural beauty? I thanked him, and I thanked him very sincerely. It's unfortunate that someone with Mr. Gorbachev's Cossack heritage and prescient vision is not leading Russia today. We'd be looking at a different world at this moment. Thank you, and I think we have time for a few questions.